Hey guys, what's going on? Andy Baker here of AndyBaker.com, and owner of Kingwood Strength and Conditioning, wearing my Train Heroic t-shirt today. So if you guys are interested, go over and check out the content on Train Heroic's blog. They were cool enough to send me a free t-shirt the other day, so I'm going to sport their brand today as a thank you for the free shirt. What we are going to do today, it is a new month. It's March, so I'm a little bit late on this Q&A. But we are going to do a Q&A for March, so I'm going to film maybe 5 or 6 videos on just some recent questions that I've had that come in via email, YouTube comments, Facebook, those sorts of things, and kind of maybe paraphrase them or consolidate them if I get multiple questions on the same topic, and then hopefully translate that back out to you guys in a way that is useful to your training program. So we're going to get started right now with a little bit of a vocabulary lesson for this first question. So this basically stemmed off of a previous video that I did on programming for MMA, where I kind of mentioned in the during that video that I implement some West Side barbell based programming with certain clients. So depending on the sport or depending on the lifestyle, then I will, beg, borrow, or steal concepts from West Side that I think are useful to a particular client or program. So, I wouldn't say that any of my clients are on just like a true blue West Side style program. And I've said it before, unless you're training at Westside with Louis, then you can't really say that you're on a Westside program. You're just borrowing concepts from Westside programming. So, and that's really all that I do. So, I think everybody in the industry, that trains strength and, barbell-based training has probably stolen at least something. If they've paid attention, from Westside stuff. There's too much good information there to not have learned at least a little bit that you can borrow or steal to implement into your own training or with your clients. So, and I am certainly no exception to that. So, but basically, what we're going to talk about is kind of a vocabulary terminology of two words that a lot of people get confused that are both associated with Westside based programming. We're going to talk about what the words are, what they mean, and then why does it even matter to you? I don't necessarily enjoy, intellectual debate unless there is some practical purpose down the line. So hopefully at the end of this, then we'll kind of look at how you can maybe think about this as it relates to your own training. So basically what we're talking about is, and people mix and match these two terms all the time, not really understanding what they mean, and so sometimes it has a negative effect if you don't really know how to apply the correct terminology to the program. But we're talking about conjugate programming versus concurrent programming. What are they, and what are the differences, and are they the same thing? And they are not the same thing at all. So when we're talking about the conjugate method or conjugate programming, basically, in a nutshell, to sum it up, all we're talking about is mixing and matching different exercises, okay, that are similar to each other on a fairly routine or regular basis. That's basically all the conjugate method is. And that's kind of a hallmark of Westside Barbell's programming, is that for both the upper body and for the lower body, or for their bench day and their squat and deadlift day, that on the max effort day where they're training heavy, it's very rarely the same movement 2 weeks in a row. Okay, so when they go in on their max effort bench day, they don't go in and bench press every day up to a max effort. It's a movement that is kind of like a bench. It could be a close grip bench, or a bench with bands, or a pin press, or an incline bench, a floor press, something that's like a bench, but that's a little bit different in the mechanics and the loading. But each time it's worked up to, a heavy 1-rep max or a heavy single. And then the same thing on the squat and deadlift day. It's not a squat and a deadlift every max effort day. It's a version of one of those two movements. So it might be a box squat, a pin squat, a squat with bands, a squat with a specialty bar like a safety squat bar, or a rack pull, or a heavy good morning, or a deficit deadlift. Basically, creativity is your only obstacle there. But it's just those movements are rotated out on a fairly regular basis. Basically, for the advanced guys, it would be on a weekly basis. So you work up to a 1-rep max you go all out, and then the next week you change the movement up. So as an advanced guy, they're probably not going to be able to work it up to a 1 rep max, and then the next week do that same movement and be able to improve upon it. Whereas maybe a more intermediate guy could do that for 2 or 3 weeks in a row with the same movement and make progress, and then he would be having to switch. But either way, probably not more than about 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So I've talked to a lot of guys that have used this in their own training that are fairly new to it, and 2 or 3 weeks is about the limit that I've seen where people can use the same movement, work up to a 1 rep max, and get progress. And after about that 3rd week, then they're not able to make any more progress on that movement, at least on that rep range. So that's all the conjugate method is. Before I shot the video, I just did a real quick kind of dictionary.com search on the word conjugate, because it's used in a lot of different contexts. And so and I'd heard this explained once before, a long time ago, about kind of where the word came from and why they chose it, and then it kind of jogged a little bit from the college days. But basically, it's a terminology that's used a lot in mathematics, particularly when you're plotting points on a graph, or you've got like lines on an XY graph. It's used a lot there to explain 2 points on a graph that are so close together that for all practical purposes, they're interchangeable. Okay, so you may not even be able to differentiate the fact that if you're looking at a graph, that there's 2 points on that graph that are not exactly the same, but they're close enough that there's a lot of overlap there, let's say. Or there's 2 lines on a graph that are so closely following each other that for all intents and purposes, all practical purposes, it's basically the same line. And as I understood it too, and they use it quite a bit in chemistry to talk about chemicals or elements that are so close to each other in their molecular structure that they can be used often interchangeably in certain experiments. So you can run this experiment and you can use this chemical or liquid, or you can use this chemical or liquid, which is basically the same thing and maybe in slightly varying amounts, and basically recreate the same type of result in whatever procedure you're trying to do. And that makes sense when you think about it in terms of how we're using it in the gym. Basically, when you're talking about the conjugate method in the gym, in a practical sense, you're selecting exercises that are different from the main movement. So they're different from a squat, a bench, or a deadlift, but they're close enough that they can basically be used interchangeably, and you're not really losing anything by not training it. Okay, especially in the context of just maybe a couple of weeks without training the parent movement. And just kind of as an aside, you actually still would be training the squat, the deadlift, and the bench press. In a true Westside program, that would be done on your speed day, where the competitive versions of the lift would be trained, or a very, very close competitive version of the lift would be trained for volume using the dynamic effort method. And obviously you don't have to use the dynamic effort method if you just want to steal some stuff from Westside. You can have a volume day where you're still having your guys squat, bench, and deadlift, maybe using a more traditional approach of sets of 5 or some kind of medium loaded exercise with more volume. So they're still not getting too far away from the parent lifts, but on the max effort day, that's when you're going to cycle through these different exercises, because you can't train if you're going to train with high intensity and maximal effort all the time. You cannot do it week in and week out with the same exercise. It won't work. So that's basically, with the conjugate method, we're not talking about with a deadlift day, it's not just a movement that is the same body part. You can't switch out a deadlift for leg curls or glute ham raises. It has to be for it to work, it's got to be deadlift switched out with rack pulls, or deadlift switched out with stiff leg deadlifts or deficit deadlifts, something that's very, very close to the performance of the lift. It really has to be a barbell movement. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 1 rep max. It could be a 2 or 3 rep max, or even a 5 rep max, depending on the exercises. Some movements aren't really safe or practical to train for heavy 1RMs. Like, I'm not a big fan of a good morning or a stiff leg deadlift for a 1 rep max, but certainly you could do a 3 rep max, or anywhere from 3 to 5 reps on those types of movements, and that would be close enough in the performance of the lift and the load where it would kind of satisfy that requirement of kind of maximal intensity. So that's the conjugate method in a nutshell. Is just the weekly or bi-weekly rotation of different movements into your program that resemble the parent lift on a regular basis. So that's all it means. Westside does not have the market on that. Okay, that they use it. It's definitely the most notable and the most notable program that uses the conjugate method, but lots of programs can use a conjugate method. Lots of bodybuilding programs you would say use the conjugate method. So there's a lot of bodybuilders that that I've talked to over the years that I know that are they very rarely do the same exercises 2 weeks in a row. So if they do their chest workout week 1, they're doing flat bench and then dumbbell incline and then some sort of other kind of fly movement or something, and then the next time they do it they're starting out with incline and flat bench and maybe dips or something. So they're constantly rotating out exercises as well. So if you wanted to, you could call that the conjugate method. We typically don't associate that terminology with bodybuilding type programs, but any type of program where you're constantly moving exercises in and out in a certain slot, you could call that the conjugate method, and that's all that it means. So or you could just call it rotating exercises. So that's kind of what I do. If you want to be less fancy. So what is the concurrent method? All right. The concurrent method, again, this is often associated with Westside, but it's certainly not specific just to Westside Barbell. Again, Westside's probably the most notable program that is a concurrent model, but lots of strength and conditioning programs are concurrent. CrossFit is a concurrent model. It's not a well executed one in my opinion, but it is definitely a concurrent model. Most of the programs that I do with my personal training clients here at Kingwood Strength and Conditioning, for people that are interested in kind of a well-rounded strength and conditioning effect, I would qualify their intermediate level programming as concurrent. Okay, so what is concurrent? Concurrent is basically just means that multiple aspects of fitness or performance, whatever you want to call it, multiple physical attributes are trained simultaneously throughout the year, week to week, month to month. Within that week, you can call it a mesocycle or whatever you want to call it, but within a certain block of time, let's call it a week or even a workout, but let's just call it a week or a month. Within that context of time, within that block of training, all physical attributes are going to be trained in that time frame. So we could be talking about work capacity. We could be talking about higher level conditioning. So we'll just call work capacity, conditioning / endurance. Those types of those kind of 3 elements to differing degrees, but we'll just keep it simple for now. Work capacity, endurance, stamina, conditioning, along with the other things that we associate more so with barbell training, which would be hypertrophy, strength, power, all these different elements that come into play. We would train them all simultaneously within one block. Now, the mistake that I think CrossFit makes is they don't, and this is the CrossFit kind of stated goal. A lot of your good CrossFit gyms and your good CrossFit coaches do it a little bit differently, where they do specialize in one thing more than the other. But I guess technically CrossFit is not supposed to specialize in anything or prioritize anything over anything else, and of course that's a mistake. So we do know that depending on the level of training advancement of the trainee, that we should absolutely be prioritizing certain things over other things, and that so people only need maybe a modicum of conditioning and endurance. Not everybody needs to go run a 10K if they're just interested in general fitness, or certainly if they're a power lifter or a bodybuilder. They only need enough conditioning to be able to train hard and recover from volume, but they don't need, they don't need to be able to squat 500 pounds and go, run a 10K. They don't need to be able to do both of those things. They only need one to, and same thing with an endurance athlete. If they want to specialize in whatever event it is, let's just call it a half marathon. If that's their thing, is to be the best half marathon runner in the world, do they need to squat 500 pounds to do that? No, of course not. And trying to prioritize that at the same level that you would prioritize their conditioning training is probably going to take away from their conditioning training. So it's not that being strong, there's no such thing as being too strong. So being able to squat 500 pounds, if you could just snap your fingers and give them that kind of strength, would that help them, provided they're still doing all of their volume on their conditioning stuff? Yeah, I think you could argue it probably would. It's the attempt to attain that's problematic. In other words, the training of being able to of of being able to work yourself up to a 500 squat, that type of training program and effort would take away from the ability to also train for a marathon or a half marathon. So, and then there's arguments about fiber type and that kind of stuff where you could argue, maybe actually being able to squat 500 pounds actually wouldn't be that that beneficial to running a half marathon. But whatever, you kind of get the point. Basically, what we're talking about is that concurrent training is you're trying to simultaneously train all of these physical qualities at once. So you can look at a West Side program and you can obviously see it. So they've got their, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of coffee. They've got their max effort day, which would be their pure strength day. Maximal strength is trained on max effort day, obviously. And then you've got a dynamic effort day, which would be a combination of both conditioning. So if you've ever done 12 sets of 2 at 70-80%, with a minute rest, that there's obviously a conditioning and work capacity thing going on there, but then there's also power. So you've got maximal strength, you've got power, you've got work capacity being trained, and then you've got your special exercises, i.e. assistance work. They call them special exercises. Everybody else calls them assistance work. Your assistance work that comes after the main barbell movements, and that's where you're getting, a little bit more work capacity training. You're doing higher reps. You're doing short intervals. You're obviously getting a lot of hypertrophy type training, so you're doing a lot of tricep extensions and lat work and glute ham work and all that sort of thing, all for higher reps, really high volume. So you're going to get quite a bit of hypertrophy from that, although it's not the focus of the program. The maximal strength and the power development is the focus of the program, and the special exercises help to build all that up. And then you've got your dedicated conditioning and work capacity training. So that would be their sled dragging. So and I don't know if they all do it, but definitely according to Louis, sled dragging is to be done at West Side 4, 5, 6 days a week. And so starting the week off heavier, with heavier sleds and less volume, and every day lightening the weight on the sled a little bit and increasing the volume, so that by the time you get to the end of the week, you're doing light loads but lots and lots of volume, and that's going to help with active recovery. So you could also think you could put recovery into the concurrent model as a physical attribute that you're constantly trying to train. So the sled dragging helps with recovery, helps with conditioning and work capacity. So that's all being done, but everything is being done in a way that supports what the main goal is, which is maximal strength displayed at a meet. So it's not for conditioning. They do sled dragging because, one, it helps with recovery, it doesn't interfere with squatting, and it builds muscle mass. So they don't say, oh, you can go drag a sled or you can go out and run 2 miles around the neighborhood after you get done training. No, because you could put the 2-mile run into the concurrent model and it would fit, but it would take away from what the ultimate objective is. So concurrent modeling, am I a fan of concurrent modeling? Of course, I think it's the most efficient way to do it, but you still have to specialize and you still have to prioritize for whoever this person is. Definitely as a novice, you don't need a lot of elements in there. You need to train strength, maybe a little bit of work capacity, and most of these other elements are going to improve with strength as a foundation. Certainly as an intermediate advanced, depending on what your goals are, not everybody's going to go to a strength sport. So some people are just looking for general fitness or whatever. You're still always going to be focused on strength, but now maybe some of these other attributes are going to take a little bit more priority and you'll dedicate a little bit more time. So certainly if a guy wants to do bodybuilding or power building type stuff, you're going to not have purely a strength-based program. You're going to start including more cosmetic and physique and hypertrophy type work, and you're going to do, more conditioning type work to allow people to train longer and harder and do more exercises and just have a better quality of life outside of the gym. So it all depends on the person, as to what you're going to prioritize on and what the focus is going to be. It depends on the person. Does every program follow a concurrent model? No, although I would say that most good programs have it to some degree, although there's obviously, like different types of block programming. Each block, which could be anywhere from a week to like 6 weeks or longer, is focused heavily on a certain attribute. So, like in some of the old strength and conditioning literature, you had your work capacity block, which would be, kind of non-specific conditioning type movements. And you might have somebody do that for, say, 2 or 3 weeks. And that would be, the stuff that's in the literature is garbage, but, it would be conditioning based stuff. Build up your endurance, go light, do lots of, it'd be like light circuit training and cardiovascular type exercises. So get your work capacity up. And then you go into a hypertrophy type routine. So lots of sets of like, 8 to 15 reps on everything. Do that for a few weeks, a few months. And then you would come down to a strength phase and you would work more in like, say, the 5 rep range. And then you would come down into a peaking and power phase where you might start including more Olympic lifts, heavier sets of 1, 2, and 3 on the barbell movements. And that would be like your peaking and power phase. So you would have work capacity, hypertrophy, strength, and then like peaking / power here at the bottom. And you might work each one of those for several weeks or several months. What's the problem with that? Well, if you take each one to its extreme and that's all you do in that block, which I think most good programs that use the blocking system don't. But if you were to take it to an extreme and that's all you did during each block, you're going to lose some of the adaptations from whatever block you're not in. So, by the time you're down here in the last week or two of the peaking and power phase, you're going to have lost a lot of the adaptation that you gained from the work capacity and hypertrophy phase. So if not trained, it's not necessarily going to stay with you. So that's kind of the argument against like a block program, is that whatever you're not in, you're losing, and if you're spending a lot of time, say, doing work capacity for 2 or 3 weeks and then 6 to 8 weeks of a hypertrophy block, and you're doing everything 10 to 15 rep range, short rest and that sort of thing, you're losing the strength and the power that you built, from your last cycle on the strength and the power phase. So that ability to express a heavy 1 rep max or whatever it is being lost as you're spending all this time doing lighter weight, volume and pumping type stuff. So now I think a good program, a well-designed block periodization model would have some element of everything in it. It just would be prioritized differently. So that by the time, when you're doing your hypertrophy block, and let's say you're going to do 6 to 8 weeks of mostly, higher repetition, very high volume stuff, maybe non-specific type exercises, while you're doing that as the meat and potatoes, a certain percentage of your work is still going to be heavier so that you don't lose. So that might just be, maybe you're just working up to a top single and then doing a bunch of back off work. So you're not completely losing all the adaptations that you had from the strength and power. They might detrain a little bit, but you won't completely lose it. Like if you just didn't do anything heavy for 8 weeks, you're obviously going to lose some of those neurological benefits that you got from training at much heavier weights, and you don't want to do that. Same thing, while you're training in a strength block or a power / peaking block, you may not have as much time dedicated to your hypertrophy work, but you may have some. You may want to do a few back off sets in the 8 to 10 range, say, or just have 1 day a week where you're doing more, higher rep type work, higher volume type work to maintain your muscle mass. You can maintain with less than it took to build it. So, and even if you do lose maybe a little bit of that kind of hypertrophy adaptation, if you build up to here and then you lose just down to here, you still might be better off than if you had started here, if that makes sense. So you build up to a certain level far and above where you were, and then you lose a little bit of it over time, but that's okay because you're still winding up way above where you were at. Okay. Now there's all kinds of arguments about, how much hypertrophy do you lose if you don't train it specifically and frequently. I think it varies from person to person, to be honest. It makes a difference, what type of training you were doing. There's a hypertrophy effect from doing a lot of pump type work that doesn't necessarily have any performance benefits. There's arguments about whether that even exists, which I think is ludicrous to say that it doesn't exist. But as far as its benefit on performance is definitely probably not debatable, in that there isn't much performance benefit from a bunch of high rep pumping type work in terms of a strength athlete. But you still, whatever muscle mass you gain, you want to try to keep for as long as possible. So that's where I think a concurrent model is probably superior. But I think whether you're doing concurrent or block, you just have to be smart about it. You have to really tailor it to the individual and their goals, and just make sure that whatever you're doing, it's not, if you're doing the block model, that there's some elements of these other attributes in your training program so that you're not completely detraining one or the other. And that includes things like work capacity. You may want to start a cycle if you're very detrained or something like that. You may want to start with, maybe a week or two of, more work capacity type work, getting yourself in shape to train. And then you can obviously back off of that quite a bit when you start training harder with the strength stuff, with the barbell stuff. But, I think all lifters past a certain point should do some type of training to keep their work capacity up. It helps you recover better between workouts. It helps you recover better between workouts and during workouts. And so you want to, all these things are important, which is why we train them. So you just have to kind of say, well, what's the most important to me for my goals and where I'm at as an athlete, and then you can come up with a good program for yourself. So anyways, guys, I went longer on this than I wanted to, but that's basically what we're talking about: concurrent versus conjugate. What does it mean for you? How does it benefit you? We just talked a lot about the concurrent model of just kind of looking at the different physical attributes and saying, which of these do I need? Which of these do I lack for my goals? Am I planning on meeting or doing a meet or competing? Am I planning on competing at a meet? And if so, I can kind of tailor my training towards that. If not, then, if I'm just a general strength athlete or a general fitness enthusiast or whatever, how do I balance these things out so that I'm kind of continuously getting some exposure to all these different things so that I keep improving in strength and in muscle mass and work capacity, and I'm not constantly on the seesaw going up and down on one thing or the other. So and I think for most people some sort of concurrent model is probably appropriate for that, so that you're kind of within a week at least, you're getting some exposure to training all the different physical attributes. So you can skew that a little bit certain parts of the year. If you go back to my article that I wrote on kind of annual periodization, you can take a look at that, where we're working up to, even this is not for even a non-competitive strength athlete, but still setting up your year to where you're working up to a peak in strength like twice a year, like once in the spring and once in the fall. And then you can kind of set up a whole year of training around that, so that you can say, okay, I'm going to compete at the end of May, even if it's by myself in my garage. I'm going to test my strength at the end of May and at the end of October. And so I can structure my training that way. So leading up to those, I can focus things on being a little bit heavier, up the intensity, and the further I am away from those things, I can focus a little bit less on intensity. I can keep training volume higher, focus more on maybe being less specific with my lifting, getting more volume in, training more for hypertrophy, that sort of thing. And then as I get closer to my testing date, things can get more specific, intensity can go up, I can back off the volume a little bit, and then you're not just kind of guessing week to week. At least you have something that makes sense month to month, week to week, that you can follow. So I would definitely take a look at that. And then as far as the conjugate method goes, can you benefit from that? Yeah, I definitely think that most people benefit from that. So, when you're thinking about the conjugate method, you don't necessarily need to switch up exercises unless you need to. And I think at a certain point, most people need to. Most people are not going to respond to doing the same 3, 4, 5 lifts over and over and over and over again, with the only adjustments being volume, intensity, and frequency. There's just only so many different permutations of sets, reps, and intensity that you can use before things start to go stale, okay? And so exercise selection is one of those things that you need to look at as a variable, and how often you change that up, well, it kind of depends on you. If you're a beginner, you don't need to change things up hardly at all. Although we would say, maybe that even on the novice program, there's a bit of conjugate method in that we alternate between the bench and the press workout to workout, and between the deadlift and the power clean workout to workout. So I wouldn't classify that as conjugate method, but you can see that there's a benefit of not doing the same exact exercises over and over and over and over again. So certainly by the time we get to intermediate programming, we're going to start introducing some variables and exercise selection, but not a ton. You don't need a ton of variables, because you're still, probably not at, kind of expert status on the main lifts. So you can still make improvements to those lifts with the smallest kind of a minimum effective dose of complexity. So when you become an intermediate, if you've been doing just basically the same sets and reps with the only variable that's increasing being load, now as an intermediate, you can, start changing not just load, but sets, reps, frequency, that sort of thing. But keeping the exercises the same. So it's the minimum effective dose of complexity. We're just changing one variable at a time. But then, fairly short order, you're going to have to look at not just sets, reps, and load and frequency, but also exercise selection. And so the benefit of that is there's a couple of benefits. One of the benefits is that there is the psychological effect of giving you something different to do on each day that you go to the gym. So most people, with the exception of a few, don't want to go to the gym every day and squat, bench, and deadlift every single day that they go to the gym. And the only thing they change is sets, reps, and loading. Most people are going to get very, very bored of that psychologically. When you're bored and not motivated and you're not having fun in the gym, you're not going to train very hard, okay? Regardless of what people will tell you, effort matters. And the more effort you're putting into the program, the better results you're going to get, even on a suboptimal program, okay? Give me consistency and give me effort over optimal programming any day of the week, all right? So I will much rather have a guy that trains his ass off 4 days a week, never misses a workout, goes balls to the wall every session, all right, rather than the guy who is on a kind of a halfway shitty program, rather than the guy that's on the best program ever, but, misses a workout every second or third week and spends more time looking at his app on his phone than he does worrying about knocking his next set, out of the ballpark. So, there's two different types of personalities there. And, most people, I want to have them training hard. So I want them to be motivated. And new exercises help with motivation. They bring enthusiasm into the gym. They're learning new skills. They're getting to test themselves on different things. It's going to be more fun. They're going to train a little bit harder. So there's a psychological benefit. There's also the real benefit of once you kind of go stale on a certain movement, one of the only ways to progress that is to get stronger on other exercises that support it. So let's just take a very easy example. Let's look at the bench press. And let's say a guy has been, fucking around with the bench press for 2 months and he hasn't made any progress. And, maybe he gets a little bit of progress here and there, but for the most part, he's kind of flatlined on it. He's screwed around with, I've tried to bench once a week. I've done twice a week. I've done 3 times a week. I've done sets of 5. I've done singles. But basically, when I look at my programming over the last couple months, I really haven't made any significant headway. What can we do? Well, why don't we bring in 2 new movements and introduce them? We don't necessarily take the bench press out of the program, but maybe we reduce the frequency of the bench press or the priority on the bench press, and we bring in inclines and close grip bench press, all right? And then we say, all right, you're not very strong on either one of these exercises, and probably because you've never done them, so probably right off the bat, you're not going to notice a whole lot of change in your bench press because you're not strong enough on these 2 other movements to where they can really create any significant movement on the bench. But we're going to still train them for a while, and we're going to get you strong on the incline, and we're going to get you strong on the close grip while we continue to train your bench. And what's going to happen over time, let's just throw some numbers out there. Let's say this guy is benching 315, all right, and he's having a hard time moving, north of 315. And he starts his incline the first time he does it. He's not very strong on it. Let's say he's benching, for sets, 185. And right now, when we start, that 185 incline press isn't going to do much for a 315 bench. He's not very good at the incline. He hasn't practiced it. It's still kind of wobbly and shaky. He can't really feel it, that sort of thing. But what happens to his incline, or what happens to his flat bench when the incline goes from 185 to 225? Has it started to make some movement on that bench? Probably a little bit. It's hard to say from one person to the next. But what happens when we go beyond 225, 250, 260? We start getting that incline closer to maybe 275. Now has his flat bench press moved? If he's continued to train that, it would be damn hard to argue that moving an incline bench press from 185 to 225 to 250 and maybe up to towards 275, it'd be a really fucking hard argument to make that is not going to produce some movement, all right? So as long as he continues to train his bench, all right? Same thing on the close grip. Maybe the first time we close grip, he only does maybe it's a little bit higher. Let's say 225 is all he can close grip. Is that 225 close grip going to move that 315 bench all that much? Maybe not. But what happens when he keeps making progress on it, and 225 goes to 245, goes to 265? As it starts to creep up and that incline starts to creep up, well, now it's going to start to produce a little bit of movement on that bench press. All right. And then what happens is you don't have to, at the beginning, and this is real important, at the beginning, these new exercises probably need to be done in addition to the parent movement. All right, because you're not creating enough stress with these exercises to maintain your strength on the bench. So you need to keep benching, but you need to do these other exercises there as well, all right, to keep to maintain your bench press strength. But once these exercises, say the incline and the close grip, once they meet a certain threshold, now they can be used on their own to supplant the bench for even a given week or a given workout or even longer, maybe even a month. Maybe for a month you just move your incline up. And you're strong enough now on the incline where you don't even have to bench, and your bench is not going to lose any significant ground. And you can really make some headway by pushing your incline up even higher, okay? And then when you start to train the bench again, you can reduce the frequency of the incline a little bit, and your bench is going to shoot way up there because it's utilizing all that strength you built on the incline, okay? At the beginning, you can't do that. At the beginning, you need to add these movements in addition to the parent exercise. But later on, you can start reducing the frequency of the parent exercise and using the assistance lift in the conjugate method, and then it'll work. And that's what Westside does. So Westside doesn't have to deadlift heavy because everything they do, these guys are advanced enough and trained with enough intensity and are strong enough where all these different variations of the deadlift, they're creating enough stress with these movements to take the place with that. If you put a novice on a safety squat bar with monster mini bands and a 10-inch box and tell him to do a max effort movement, it's just going to look like a train wreck. He's not going to do shit with that. Okay, so that movement can't supplant the back squat because he doesn't have the skill to do it. And when you don't have the skill, you can't produce the stress that you need to supplant the movement. But you take a guy that's been training for 20 years, he's not going to lose anything by not squatting for a week. And if he can do a safety squat bar with mini bands off of a 10-inch box, okay, he has enough skill as an athlete and as a lifter where he can create enough stress with that movement to fill the void that's left by not squatting, okay? And I think that's really, really important to understand. So does the conjugate method work? Yes, but it's not a novice technique. You need to give it time. So anyways, I rambled on even longer than I thought I was. So I'm at 36, 37 minutes right now. So I appreciate you guys listening. And I'm going to come back here in next week with some more Q&A stuff. So, all right, guys, thanks a lot.